The G7 group of countries met earlier this week, and as a reminder, that's Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. They talked about Ukraine and Iran, Iran and Ukraine, and of course, there was plenty of attention over when shipping might resume through the Strait of Hormuz. You know what they didn't talk about? Climate change.
The other members of the G7 have figured out that if you talk about climate, you're going to have a dead conversation with President Trump, or worse, there could be retaliations. And so everyone's doing climate at home, doing climate with each other, and they're not talking with President Trump about that. And so there's been a kind of hushing around climate in these diplomatic settings. There's been a hushing around climate inside Washington, D.C. People are still doing it, but they're calling it something different.
That's David Victor. He's a professor at the University of California, San Diego, and its School of Global Policy and Strategy. He's also co-author of Fixing the Climate: Strategies for an Uncertain World. And what he said about Trump, well, there's definitely a long track record of the U.S. president being a climate skeptic.
Climate change. Because if it goes higher or lower, whatever the hell happens, this climate change, it's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion.
Now, David said something interesting there. Did you catch it? Here it is again.
They're calling it something different.
They're calling climate change something different. What David means is at this latest G7 and at other international summits, you can talk about climate change, just not quite use that term. I mean, think about it. One of the biggest results of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has been a global reevaluation of renewable energy. But the language around that has pivoted.
Yeah, I think what's happened is that the global lateral approaches, going to the UN, talking about everything in the context of Paris, that those conversations are still going on. Very few people are talking about, giving up on Paris altogether. But Paris really needs to be thought of as a kind of a compass or an umbrella. And all else equal, when the United States becomes a less reliable or even hostile participant, then you see more countries talking about climate in terms that either don't involve the United States at all or talk about it in terms of energy security and so on. We're seeing exactly that. When the confidence in the international rules-based system on trade, on finance, and so on, when confidence in that goes down, then you see more efforts to onshore, to work in smaller clubs of countries that are reliable partners. We're seeing this in Europe in particular. We're seeing a lot of what are called plurilateral agreements. So agreements, we have small numbers of countries, and then there's an open door for other countries to join. We're seeing a lot more of that. And so the landscape of cooperation has been shifting away from a global lateral kind of uniform landscape in the direction of something that's more undulating, lots of little pockets here and there. And that was going on already. The kind of exit of the United States from the international system, although it tends to be overstated, that exit has just accelerated that pattern.
It wasn't that long ago when meetings like the G7 would usually mean some kind of statement on climate change, what's often called a communiqué. Each country would commit to some benchmark and share what it plans to do to combat rising temperatures. We're seeing a lot less of that. And yes, it goes back in part to the American president's clear distaste of environmental issues. But David says that's okay. These global meetups do not have to be the main way to get things done.
I guess I would see the G7 and the G20 and NATO and the UN. These are all institutions that are kind of options. They're there to help when they need to help. And so quite often, because there's a schedule and people go to G7 meetings and they need something to do and something to say, we have a lot of coverage about it, even when they're not really doing anything. And that's helpful because whatever the agenda topic is, that puts a spotlight on that. Clearly, the aftermath or the reliable end, and the aftermath of the war in Iran is going to be a big part of that. Rebuilding in Ukraine, when we get there, that's going to be part of that. For most topics, the G7 really, I don't think is the main forum. It's going to be a mixture of bigger forums that involve more developing countries like the G20, and then very small groups of highly motivated countries. The United States, China, bilateral, super important. Quad countries, India's rising rising in importance. And then we're seeing this in NATO as well, where frankly, the ability of NATO, because of the United States behavior and some other countries, the ability of NATO as an institution across the board to get things done is probably declining, whereas you have some highly motivated European countries plus Canada inside NATO that are committed, for example, on the Ukrainian front. And that's where a lot of the energy is happening.
What David said there was super interesting, so I asked him to dive a little deeper into that. How are governments working in smaller groups, and how effective has that been?
Yeah, I think it's always been the case that people talked global, but when you looked at what they really did, they were working in small groups and clubs, what used to be called coalitions of the willing. That's always been the case. Frankly, that was the design of the Paris Agreement, is it's a global umbrella, but then under that umbrella, you can have pockets of efforts in different sectors of the economy, different kinds of firms and governments, and all of it counted as being part of the Paris approach. I think you got a lot of governments right now that are trying to figure out how do you weigh the security concerns, how do you weigh the weakening and discombobulated relationship with the United States with goals like climate. One of the countries that is doing this most conspicuously right now is Canada, where you see the Canadian government trying to disentangle its closest economic trading relationship with the United States. It's very dependent on, for example, in the United States to import oil by pipeline. And so they're building a pipeline to Western Canada to decouple from the United States. That will result in continued hydrocarbon production in Canada, but that's very important for parts of the Canadian economy, especially in Alberta, the province in the middle that has most of the oil. Where there are secession movements. And so if you're the Prime Minister of Canada, you've got to manage all that stuff and not just do climate. And across the board, I'd say the left-leaning parties are finding less traction on climate and more traction on things, bread and butter topics, jobs, economic growth, fears of AI generating more unemployment, and things like that.
And it's true. Climate change as a term is generally associated with left-of-center political parties around the world, when really saving the planet, saving ourselves, all of us, should be a bipartisan or multi-partisan issue. But when one entire half of the political spectrum is not on board, then you can't get things done.
This is a big risk for the climate community. If folks don't realize the politics have shifted, don't figure out how to talk about climate in ways that connect that topic to things that voters more reliably care about, jobs, economic performance, and so on, then the movement is in trouble. And in some parts of the world, including the United States, there's a risk that big parts of the climate movement get kind of turned into culture wars. Think about the blowback against electric vehicles. We see this with regard to wind, especially offshore wind, efficient light bulbs. And so when that gets worked into the culture wars, then it makes it much, much harder to put together and hold together a centrist coalition that wants action. And that's what we're starting to see.
David was really quite hopeful that despite the term climate change falling off the agenda at a lot of these big meetings, the world is still moving forward.
Some of this is the diplomatic maneuvering around the United States in particular. And it's really, really important. If you have the world's most powerful country that started the war in Hormuz, doesn't want to talk about a subject, they're going to get their way, at least for a while. And so other countries will find other ways of taking on these subjects. The overall picture still is very impressive. 15, 20 years ago, the world was on track for 4 or 5 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels. Now we're on track for 2.8, maybe 3 degrees, something like that. That's for a lot of reasons, but one of them is policies have begun working. Despite all the economic chaos in the world, the data show that investment in clean energy has been going up. But what's happening because of all the chaos is that firms and governments are overweighting the investments in things that where they're already in the money, where the technologies are already mature. So electric vehicles, electric power grids, battery storage systems, solar and wind. We're starting to see more interest in nuclear power as well, some new interest in geothermal. And as the technologies mature, those become better bets. Whereas the technologies that are really expensive and where you need policy support from government, you're not sure government's going to be reliable, especially in the United States, those are the places that have really taken a hit, for hydrogen, for example.
So, in conclusion, it took scientists and activists to raise the alarm. Then there were governments who took the lead, the United States once upon a time being one of them. And then the business world, the investors, entrepreneurs, and companies seeing the economic rewards.
To me, what what I find most hopeful is that a whole lot of firms that used to be doubling down on coal-fired power and so on have recognized that there's money, sometimes even more money, to be made in renewables and nuclear and other things that are clean. We've seen this a lot with natural gas. Natural gas is playing a very important role. It's still a fossil fuel, still emissions, much lower emissions than with coal, and so in that sense, call it cool or call it not cool, that's a lot of that's kind of high frequency noise. When you look under the hood at the investment data show that this is continuing forward, and that gives me a lot of hope. And my theory of change here is that as the technologies get better, things that used to be hard politically get easier because they're less costly, and so technological change in the clean direction generates its own tailwinds, and we're seeing a lot of that. And that's what gives me some ongoing hope, even though at a higher level, the rhetoric around climate is less visible for reasons that I think are totally understandable.
So what do you think? Should world leaders talk more about climate change? Or do you agree with David that the world is dealing with climate change already, but might not be talking about it in the same way as it used to? Let us know in the comments. That's all for now. DW News is giving you the latest across our social media channels. I'm Melissa Chan. Until next time.